Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. In this episode, we are going to be talking about the suspected Chinese balloon, from its purpose to the diplomatic crisis it helped create. Joining me to talk about this suspicious balloon are Aditya Ramanathan, who knows a bit about high-altitude balloons, and Manoj Kewalramani, who knows a bit about China. Welcome, Aditya and Manoj.
Hey, thanks, Pranav. We're glad to be here.
Aditya, I would like to begin with you. Now, high-altitude balloons, or as you call them, airships, are not actually new. They're in fact very old and they've been used since 1940s. Can you tell our listeners about the history of high-altitude balloons and their uses in national security purposes?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Pranav. So, we should really, the prehistory of the high altitude balloon is, of course, just the regular hot air balloon first. And then after that, the modern airship, which emerges in the 19th century, right? So the hot air balloon has been used for strategic or military purposes really since the 1790s, since the French Revolutionary Wars. But again, very briefly, it was then used on and off for observation of an enemy in a battlefield, for example, during the American Civil War in the 1860s. And a little before that, during the Italian wars of unification or independence, the Austrians used air balloons for bombardment of Venice during the siege of that city. That's probably the first instance of aerial bombardment in history. But yes, what we're really talking about is modern airships and not hot air balloons. So there's a lot of puns going around about this whole crisis being full of hot air and all that. But I mean, it doesn't really make sense because these are airships that use either hydrogen in the early days and now almost entirely helium. Yeah, so the modern airship gets invented in the late 19th century, and that's when it starts evolving beyond it being a curiosity. In the First World War, you have airships bombing cities, and they're also providing artillery spotters with a important vantage point from which to direct fire on the enemy, especially on the Western Front. And airships become prime targets for warplanes. So warplanes start shooting them down. In fact, there's an American ace who was credited with shooting down 14 German balloons over Europe. And they're also used as offensive tools of war, like I mentioned, bombing cities. If you have seen or recall Howard Hughes' talking picture from 1930, Hell's Angels, has this amazing shot where a Zeppelin emerges out of the clouds and it's attacked by warplanes. That was the era in which they were still used offensively. After that, they sort of retreat to a sort of supporting role by the Second World War because warplanes come to their own and, airships are completely outclassed. And you do see them being used occasionally for some purposes that would seem very relevant to us today. For example, the American K-ships were used for anti-submarine warfare. They basically used a lot of the key strengths of a Zeppelin or a rigid airship of any kind, which is to stay around in the air for a long period of time. The persistence is really one of the big selling points of any such airship. And so that basically allows you to cover a large area, accompany a convoy, so on, look for submarines that are breaking through the surface, and occasionally attack them also yourself. But coming to high altitude balloons, the high altitude balloon is really invented in 1944, and it's not invented by the Americans or the Soviets. It's invented or the Germans. It's invented by the Japanese. And really, in a sense, the Japanese use high altitude balloons to create the first intercontinental striking weapons of any kind, right? So essentially what happens is that the Japanese discover the Pacific jet stream in the stratosphere. And they create these balloons which are able to fly at altitudes of over 30,000 feet. So they basically move between an altitude of about 30,000 feet and 38,000 feet. And they fly on the Pacific jet stream and reach the continental United States, at least some of them. So now apparently about 9,000 of these balloons were launched. And the idea was apparently to set off forest fires in parts of America and basically, force the Americans to devote a lot of resources to that. Unfortunately for the Japanese, when these attacks occurred, it was mostly rainy season in America, so forest fires weren't going to happen. Also, of the about 9,000 balloons that were launched, only a few hundred seem to have reached the United States. And when I should point out, these balloons had an explosive payload. And sometimes those explosive payloads went off, sometimes they didn't. And one time, one of these balloons, which had just landed somewhere in the outdoors, was found by a bunch of picnickers. And apparently when they were dragging the remnants of this balloon away, it exploded and killed 5 or 6 people. And they were probably the first or the only Americans killed between then and on the continental United States by direct enemy action between then and perhaps the first World Trade Center bombing in 1993. So yeah, quite a storied history, quite a spectacular way to begin this, this saga of the high altitude balloon. After the Second World War, balloons really, high altitude balloons certainly don't really have much of a role, at least not that I'm aware of. But what we've seen in general is the emergence of airships for commercial purposes. So people have been trying to design airships for recreational purposes. You have airships or blimps being used for advertisement. And there's, for example, Google's Loon program, which intends to use airships for basically providing internet in remote areas. So you've seen a return of civilian use of balloons. Now, high altitude balloons are also being used for scientific purposes, like studying the atmosphere. I am not personally aware of any systematic use until now of high altitude balloons for surveillance. So what's happened with this alleged airship or balloon is quite interesting.
And that's quite a fascinating history. And just to add on, during the Cold War, there was a American cereal company called General Mills that made packaging material with new polymers. And they helped build some of the first spy balloons for the Americans to surveil over the Soviet Union. These were, of course, rendered very useless because the Soviets were able to detect them by radar. But it's quite fascinating because one of these balloons actually fell near Roswell, and it famously became the Roswell alien crash story. So just to give our listeners a background about what exactly happened with the Chinese balloon. On January 28th, the suspected balloon entered US airspace. It started its journey from China and went over Alaska, flew over Canadian airspace, and then came to the US and traveled from the Midwest to the East Coast. So what do you think, Aditya, is this balloon? Some people say that it is for taking pictures, but we know that there are more effective methods of doing this, such as using spy satellites, which the Chinese have in abundance. Some others say it's electronic intelligence. But what do you think the technical capabilities of this high altitude airship is?
I think there are 3 possibilities, and one of them is the most likely. So one possibility is that this is in fact a balloon or airship entirely meant for scientific purposes. That's entirely possible. It's possible that the Chinese are just really interested in atmospheric science and climate change. And then this could have drifted over the US. The second is that this is actually some kind of surveillance balloon, or at least a scientific research balloon that can also do surveillance at the very least, but that it did not intend to really go over the continental United States. And in fact, while it was a spy balloon, it accidentally drifted because, balloons do have, or airships do have, limited maneuverability. The third possibility is that it is in fact a surveillance balloon, and the Chinese did in fact intentionally fly it over the US. Now, why would they intentionally fly it over the US? I myself hard-pressed to give explanations for this. It's possible that airships can do a few things that satellites can't in such situations. There's not much to be, had by simply going over a fixed site, like, for example, silos and so on. But, high altitude airships can pick up atmospheric signals. They can pick up electromagnetic radiations from air defenses. They can, measure the thermals in the atmosphere. All of these could have potential military uses. Now, but beyond that, I'm not able to think of any particular applications for flying over the US. Now, on the other hand, I think such balloons or airships are really useful for maritime surveillance. I think they're really useful for tracking navies, for tracking a carrier strike group, for understanding the rhythms of its operations. When do planes take off and land? What are their patrol radiuses? When do ships talk to each other? Now, this sort of thing is really useful to understand, not just for purely kinetic purposes, but even if, for example, you have an American carrier group transiting through the Taiwan Straits tomorrow, you want to understand how exactly they function. So it would be nice to have that kind of information. And a surveillance balloon flying over international waters may be a perfectly sensible way of trying to glean some information. I don't know beyond that what sort of sensors it had. I think the salvage operations are ongoing as we record this episode. So I'm sure we'll end up learning something, but I would not, at this stage, completely take at face value all the claims that the Americans make in the coming weeks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Aditya. Manoj, I would like to come to you. We've heard previously about Chinese incidents of espionage. Chinese incidents of espionage are not new. Quite a lot of accusations about how they use human intelligence to gather information using devices. But is this the first time we are hearing, this sort of violation of airspace using high altitude airships or balloons? Or have there been other recorded incidents from India or Vietnam or one of the Southeast Asian countries?
So, I mean, look, the first point is that spying on each other is something that all powers do, particularly great powers. So, spying on each other is not necessarily new. In terms of using this mode of violation to spy on each other, look, at least what the Americans are saying, and I was reading about this today, where apparently the US government says that it has been briefing 40 countries about what happened with this espionage surveillance balloon. It says that they've spoken to dozens of missions since 2018 across 5 continents, with some sort of such similar incidents targeting countries like Japan, India, Vietnam, the Philippines, and Taiwan. And their argument is that Wendy Sherman's briefing apparently says something to the effect of, look, this is something that has been an ongoing effort by Beijing, and it's linked to, and I quote from the Reuters report, an extensive military surveillance effort centered on the Hainan Island in the South China Sea. So from their perspective, it is something that has been ongoing. What we've also heard in the last week is that there were at least 3 similar such sort of balloon transgressions, if I could call it that, in across the US during the Trump administration. And the officials sort of engaged with security at that point of time in the US are quoted as saying that, yes, there were these incidents, but we didn't necessarily have the capability of tracking them. And that capability is something that we've developed over a period of time. So in that sense, it is perhaps relatively new. But as this incident is sort of brought to light, there's much more information that possibly will come to fore about the nature of this thing. From the Chinese point of view, what they have said is, like what Aditya had pointed out, that this is purely civilian research. It was something that blew off course, and it's a private company's product. It's nothing to do with the state. The US says that it might be a private company's product, but you're not telling us which company. And reporting from media like the Washington Post and all basically tells us that the suspected company is sort of part of civil military fusion in China. So at present, I mean, my sense is that there's, at least in the public domain, what we know is that there is a tremendous degree of confusion, but there appears to be some sort of a pattern to the use of such airships for surveillance. And Aditya has pointed out what could be the utility of such airships for surveillance. But yeah, at least from the American point of view, what we're hearing is that while they are also, the salvage operation is continuing and they are sort of figuring out what they can gather from this particular airship, then apparently the make of it with the use of solar panels and so on and so forth, their argument is that it's not your run-of-the-mill weather monitoring system. There's much more to it. And also in the last week, we heard about apparently another balloon somewhere in Latin America. So it's obviously not the only one. So, I mean, that's as far as what we know. Whether there have been others, at least what the Americans seem to be saying is that, yes, there have been others.
It's really interesting because, yeah, this is the first time even I'm coming to hear of it. But this incident has become very public, and it became a very public incident and created a sort of a diplomatic crisis. The US Secretary of State Anthony Blinken had to cancel his visit to China. And China later, once the balloon was shot down on February 4th, issued a very strong statement after repeated statements they issued saying that this was a weather balloon that had gone off course. And they finally had a strong word where they said if they observed a similar incident in Chinese territory, they would take strident action. And it also became a little funny because some Chinese embassy accounts were poking fun at the plane that shot the balloon down, the F-22. And it somehow created this crisis, and it sort of seemed to have worsened the US-China relations, which might have picked up around this point. So what's happening on the diplomatic side? And can this issue resolve itself over time? That is, will it suddenly fade away in a few weeks and months, or will this become a serious issue at some point?
Yeah, so look, my view on this is that this issue is not really a huge issue. And that's basically because it's a huge public issue, yes. And once things are in public, politicians have to address them. And you have to take steps because domestic politics is paramount. And that's why you saw the cancellation of Antony Blinken's trip to Beijing. And of course, that's why you also saw this issue being referenced in President Biden's State of the Union address this morning. Right? He talked about violation of sovereignty last week by China. So to that effect, yes, it is a significant issue. In the grand scheme of things of the US, of the relationship between the US and China, I don't think this is a major issue. I think the relationship has been on a downward spiral for a significant number of years now. In November, when Xi Jinping and President Biden met in Bali, there seemed to be some sort of an agreement that you need to have quote unquote guardrails. And to that effect, both sides started engaging again. It was the Chinese who had broken down engagement after Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan in August. And then you had a steady stream of series of sort of meetings and engagements between Chinese and American officials, including conversations between defense officials. And Blinken's trip was supposed to set this sort of stage for something else, for something a little bit more meaningful. Xi Jinping had spoken about the need for a new framework for the two sides to understand each other's engagement given the turbulent circumstances that they find themselves in. And Blinken's trip was supposed to sort of at least kickstart that process. Even when you see the trip being called off, what you see is neither side being terribly happy about it. If you look at what the Americans are saying, they call it a postponement. They don't call it essentially a cancellation of the visit. And to me, that's a nod to the fact that engagement has to continue, but now is not the optimal time given what's just happened. Secondly, if you see the Chinese side, and if you read what Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi told Blinken, he also essentially emphasized the fact that, we would like to see this conversation continue and we don't necessarily want to see it being derailed. But at the same time, I think you can see how badly Beijing managed all of this, because while the Americans had to do what they had to do, what the Chinese did was give very, very clunky responses. The first one was to say, well, we don't really know what this balloon is all about. The next one was to say that, it's a civilian airship used for research and, it entered into US airspace due to force majeure. And then, once officially Blinken's trip was postponed, the Chinese foreign ministry said something to the effect of, well, they can say what they want to say. We never announced that there was a trip going to take place. So it's sort of like telling us that it was a fantasy that there was a meeting that was going to happen. And then finally, once this balloon was shot down, there was this angry statement, like you mentioned, right, that we reserve the right to take sort of proportionate action when it comes to sort of similar circumstances. That is tricky, right? But I don't know whether that is something that is an immediate response that we will see from China. I think that once Nancy Pelosi had visited, it was highly likely that Beijing would respond angrily, because there's also domestic political demonstration effect that was needed heading into the 20th Party Congress. And it gave them an opportunity to sort of set a new normal in the Taiwan Strait. This, I don't think at present is something that they want to do. I don't think they want to escalate. And escalation would be foolhardy, because it is in Beijing's interest to arrive at some sort of a rebalancing of the relationship with the United States, because let's face it, the Chinese economy is in very bad shape right now. And what for the last 2 months, or 2.5 months, what we've seen from Beijing is some sort of an outreach to the rest of the world, including the United States, European countries, Australia, Japan, to try and see if you can have some sort of a tactical reset so that at least economic prospects continue to remain steady and the pressure that they've been feeling is sort of reduced a little bit. So I don't see it in Beijing's interest at present to try and do something tit for tat. I don't think that there is domestic pressure to do that also. I think if you monitor Chinese social media, there's a lot of conversation, there's a lot of amusement around the fact that this became such a big deal in the US. So that I think persists. And I don't think even in the US it changes fundamentally the political discourse on China. What it might do, and what it perhaps has done, is that it's only strengthened this sense that China is a near peer competitor. And if there was anybody who was not taking that seriously, those arguments will have far less purchase. So to that effect, yes, it does have an impact. And the immediate short term, it did have an impact. But in the long run, I don't think it significantly alters the direction or dynamics of the relationship.
Yeah, thanks, Manoj. Really, you gave that very nice evolution of Chinese statements, which I failed to observe in the first time. But also, I think what reminds me that you said this is, in the grander scheme of things, this is very small. It reminds me of all the past incidents where American drones were spotted over Iran or the other countries, and even Iran shot down American stealth drone. And they gave the parts after meticulously reverse engineering the American spy plane. So yes, this might not be a very big incident. It might not be a big incident after all. But the other point is that, does it set any sort of a precedence for how countries come to define territorial sovereignty, because high altitude balloons, these go sometimes above 150,000 feet. They travel really, really high up, and sometimes it's not considered to be a very big problem. Aditya and Manoj, do you think it sets some sort of a precedence over how countries interpret, or are they going to forget it completely in a few weeks?
Aditya, I was only going to kick the ball to you by saying that, I'm not certain what degree of altitude falls under territorial airspace. I'm not certain of what the legal ruling on that is. But look, this was clearly in US territorial airspace and it had full right to do what it did. So, yeah, the rest, I presume Aditya might know better than me what the definition
Yeah, sure.
is.
Manoj, I'm afraid I'm
Okay.
as confused as the attempts at making laws about this are. But yeah, basically there is some jurisdictional line between, or supposed to be between air law and space law. But, basically I think typically in practice, people use the Karman line, which is typically again defined at something like 100 kilometers. But, so basically I think if something is in orbit, nobody's going to contest it. But if something is suborbital, which is, really beyond about 80 kilometers, you can't really be orbital, right? So once you're below about that line, I don't think there's any legal ambiguity about that being your national territorial airspace. So I don't think it actually will make a huge difference. There's obviously some confusion. We're hearing silly statements about how Americans should now shoot down Chinese satellites and stuff like that. And I think some American politician asserted that America should shoot down such Chinese balloons if they come within 100 kilometers of US territory, which is again not just in violation of international law. It would put, for example, America sends its EP-3 spy planes very close to China's own territory, right? It would put those under risk. So I don't think it's actually going to make a big difference. I think where you might see some changes is the Americans have been tracking what they call unidentified aerial phenomena, or UAPs. And I think last year they had something like 163 of what they call balloon or balloon-like incidents. Some of these may not just be optical illusions or airborne crash. Some of these may actually be balloons of various kinds, or some subset of that might actually be Chinese surveillance balloons. So I think that we might see more energetic pursuit or attempts to detect such balloons in the future. I would also expect that the Chinese are going to react to this and be more cautious in the future. So we might see fewer such balloon incidents, even though there might be greater efforts made to detect them.
Thank you very much, Aditya. And with that, I would like to thank both of you for joining me on this podcast. It's been quite a ride seeing the journey of this balloon from east to the west. It is literally the balloon's journey to the west and then back to the east. So it's been quite a fun episode. I learned a lot from both of you. Thank you, Manoj and Aditya. And thank you very much for joining us on All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.